The story begins a casual afternoon when students were returning to their homes from school. A sudden procession of special military-grade vehicles moving on the road with quite special students in tow. The vehicles were branded with the symbol of Warrior High. A few years back, terrifying events occur. Out of nowhere, gates and portals opened across the vivid sky with monsters flowing out, terrorizing the world. Later on, it was scientifically concluded that a planet similar to Earth existed far away across the universe. The certain planet had mysteriously exploded and the remnants flew towards Earth. Parts of both the planets started to fuse. It was termed as adhesion phenomena. That was how the unusual and monstrous flora and fauna were introduced on Earth. It affected percent of the entire planet. As the monsters raged, humans started to lose control over the lands, and the dangerous territories were eventually termed dungeons. The unknown monsters were strong, unlike the humans who weren't prepared for such a sudden a scenario. But they were fortunate. The other world had brought not just disasters alongside it. The limitations the humans of Earth had previously also shattered. They acquired tremendous powers to deal with the monsters they faced. Although the situation affected every human equally, the powers they awakened was variable individual to individual. The chosen humans started to train their body and skills with the sole reason to regain their control over what was theirs. These certain humans were called adventurers. That was how the age of dungeons and adventures began, when both clashed and humans emerged victorious. The entire world acknowledged their accomplishments and were inspired by them. Soon enough, centers and organizations engaging and training adventurers emerged, and amongst them the best institution in the Republic of Korea, which had managed to produce the best adventurers for the past years, was the world-renowned Warrior High School. While the returning students were discussing, the schoolgirls shout and scream at the sight of a half-elf Dai of Choi. He was a first-year student at Warrior High who had survived the dungeon times. His father was a famous adventurer himself, and mother, an elf. He apparently was a genius and future top ranker. While the two friends argue it out, deciding their next destination, they asked their third friend Jar-young if he was yet again off to work. He apologizes while looking at his phone's screen. It was a notification to pay the hospital bills that were due. One of the guys complains while the other punches him, saying that it was understandable. When he goes off, he asks his friend to be more sensitive and reasonable. On his way back, a notification from a certain person named Chief appears on a screen, notifying he at work and asking him to come over. He walks into a rundown subway where the apparent Chief Yiyuan shows him of the client of the day. At the sign of a student, the client shouts at Jehuan, demanding answers, since he asked for the best, but a kid had showed up feeling he was being scammed. Jario mockingly calls for the bodyguard the client had brought alongside him, as if a former adventurer. At his rude remarks, the client starts screaming yet again, but the bodyguard adventurer hushes him, decisive to beat Jar-young up and break a limb or two. He was Lee Pilju, a former silver-ranked adventurer who had survived dungeons times before retiring. Silver ranks were offered to individuals who had records of surviving dungeons for over times. Jariel, now hyped, lets loose. He exclaims that how he was unable to ask forgiveness. He was a first-year student who had survived dungeon raids times. Although illegally, he was a dungeon smuggler, while adventurers worked hard every day before their exit. Associations were to inspect the loot they acquired, since the circulation of something unknown and powerful would endanger lives. As such, the treasures and items are first inspected and then taxed. But there always exist individuals who break norms. The dungeon smugglers were people who would pocket such treasures and loot illegally, causing the loss to the society as a whole. The client shouts at Yiyuan, asking if he wanted to continue since Pilju had a sore temper and had previously killed one of his teammates. Yiyuan asks him not to be scared, but he argues, saying the kid would really die. Pilkier reasons, saying he was being dragged down by the apparent teammate and then hence trashed him. Jariel, now certain that such an act might have forced his retirement, but is cut off in his words by Pilju's rapid punch. Jarian dodges agilely Pilju punches yet again, which he blocks, and decides to return him a light kick straight in his face. Yiyuan asks the client to witness the best he had asked for himself. Jar-young is a bit disappointed since he expected a retired adventurer to put up a decent fight. Lee Pilju was astonished. He had thought of the smuggling team before him as a mere child, but the reflexes Jarian displayed were well qualified. As a pro, he rips apart his shirt and screams, decisive to beat him down. Adventurers took training to hone their awakened abilities. Pilju's abilities were sorted around body strengthening, which was why he was a tank, a position where one takes incoming damages to shield their party members. Tanks would train their physical bodies that could best monsters and even bullets, and top-tier tanks could even take missiles head-on. They were, in other words, a shield. Pilju uses two of his skills, Iron Skin and Giant Strength. A green aura now enveloping him. This was a real adventurer. He pummels the ground with his fists, blasting Jariel away. Yiyuan exclaims at his crude behavior. Jarian focuses on Pilju, who punches at his face but hits the wall behind. He asks why Jarian was suddenly being so distant. Jehuan analyzes that Pilju was almost at the level of a decent truck capable of pulverizing someone on hit. He asks Jarian to quickly wrap it up. warning that any delay would dock his pay. Chu closes in saying Yi-Yuan wasn't aware of the ongoings and reminds Jarian that none of his previous cheap tricks would work since he now was fighting as a pro-tanker. Jarian picks up a nearby steel rod and judges it to be good enough. While Pilji was charging at him with full force, Jarian picks up his steel rod. Yi-Yuan says that it was now over. While tanks might appear as unbeatable beings, they had one fatal weakness: a natural enemy, a certain someone who could focus a powerful and devastating force in a single point, for example a damage dealer. As the two close in on each other, Jerry Young swings the rod in his hand in one fluid motion, knocking Pilju out instantly. The broken Pilju asks of where he had managed to learn that particular move. Jarion decides it might as well be probable, since he might have seen his father when Jario was a little kid. His father was the greatest adventurer to him. It wasn't solely because he was his father. His name was Yusun, one of the first-generation heroes. Although it was now a legendary tale, but back then it was hellish. The biggest drawback was the lack of information. There were no answers to what dungeons were or what monsters lay deep within them. The monsters well known now were the greatest calamities back then. At that day and age, there weren't neither enough skills nor items to utilize in such dire conditions. The first-generation adventurers had to rely on the method or trial and error while risking life and limb. The survivors passed on their experience and accomplishments to the next generations. These adventurers were known as heroes. Yusung was a dragon slayer, a nickname given after he had defeated a dragon and stood proudly as Asia's top ranker. He also was Jirian's father. He respected and admired him the most while watching him practice in Og during his younger years. He believed he was invincible, but he was suffering. He watched his father fall with teary eyes, the cause being poison. He had come across some lethal poison during one of his previous explorations. Like every prior ordeal, he tried to overcome it, but after decades of futile efforts, his body was at its limits. The colleagues whom his father had trusted and took advantage of his vulnerability and stole his fortunes and deeds. He suffered mentally and physically for countless years. Later, when the world was forgetting of Yukaion the Dragon Slayer, his father had lost his identity as a hero after losing his everything. All that remained was an unknown legacy. While Jarian walks away, Jaeyuan informs the client that the pay he was to pay was doubled since he had provoked them previously. Yeyuan asks Jariang if he knew of the Imperial Wasp. He spits out the water he was drinking in shock and disbelief, inquiring if he had to fight it. It was a monster whose danger gradient was of the highest in the entire world. The place you would know where it had made its nest became Korea's most difficult demon realm. Reports that the government had organized an unpublicized raid consisting of all of the country's top rankers. Although they had failed in their motive of eradication, they had successfully killed the queen bee. One of the top hunters had smuggled the royal jelly of the bees through his subordinates. Jarian is startled of why a top ranker would smuggle some insignificant nutritional supplement. Jaeyuan informs him further that the previous records of royal jelly showed that when consumed by a human, it could bring people back from the dead. At the mansion of this, Jarian froze in his steps. Although the government and Hunters Association claimed to be strictly managing the gates to the dungeons, but it wasn't the reality. Yeyuan helps him through one of such gates, asking him to stay careful and avoid death. Jario was lost in thoughts, and he blows his cigar smoke in his face, which brings him back. The royal jelly had piqued his interest the day before. Although it might be a disproportionate lie, he had to try to cure his father. He enters a vivid and vast expanse, sunlight beaming right at his face. It was a place formerly known as Borim, a D-ranked dungeon. After the great incident due to the adhesion phenomena, there were two major fusion dungeons in Korea. One was Jeju-do, a dungeon fused with the volcanic terrain, while the other was fused with the dagger jungle located at the very center of Seoul. Uido with Uido and it's the center. The neighboring places had also fallen under the monster's vast regions were still undiscovered, and hunters still lost their lives trying to explore it. Yeyuan had previously explained that it was predicted that the subordinate smuggler had sneaked the jelly into Borim, but had immediately lost contact after reaching. All Jarian was supposed was to retrieve what was previously lost. Yeyuan knew that because the royal jelly was so potent, not only hunters but also monsters would be attracted towards it. He asked Jariel to solely focus on the retrieval and not get distracted throughout. He drops dead center into the agar forest. He already knew that the smell would be widespread, but is dumbfounded at the size of monsters it had attracted amongst the trees with birds chirping around. A black-haired elven girl with a bow ran past the trees and hid behind one. She was Jean Sarum, a first-year student at Warrior High who was currently in the most dire situation, although it should have been a pretty easy trip to the dungeon to her for her midterm exams, but the predicament she faced was a monster that should have never been. That's it for today. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.